Certainty. Imagine there are two online reviews of a new restaurant. One of the reviews comments, "This is absolutely the best Italian meal you'll ever have." The other review comments, "I don't know, but I kind of feel like maybe this could be the best Italian meal you'll ever have." If you're like most people, you'd be far more inclined to try the restaurant if you read the first review. This simple example illustrates that sources who express their views with certainty and confidence tend to be more persuasive. This is because people generally judge certain and confident sources to be more credible, and as we've seen, source credibility is persuasive. By and large, then, if your goal is to persuade someone, it wouldn't be a bad idea to express confidence in your viewpoint. Research conducted in various real-world contexts supports this idea. For example, studies of jurors show that people judge how credible eyewitnesses are based on the confidence they express when they give their testimony. This is true despite the fact that the actual association between eyewitness confidence and accuracy is rather weak. In a similar vein, people regard financial advisors who express high confidence in their stock forecasts as more knowledgeable than those who express less confidence, and the more confident advisors are accordingly chosen more often by clients. Message characteristics. Aspects or content of a persuasive message, including the quality of the evidence and the explicitness of its conclusions. Message characteristics. What are the message characteristics that make a persuasive appeal most effective? By now you should be able to anticipate the answer from the perspective of the elaboration likelihood model, ELM. It depends on the audience's motivation and ability to process the message. Message quality. As you saw in Figure 8.1, high-quality messages are more persuasive in general, especially for people who are strong in motivation and ability. Messages are of higher quality when they appeal to core values of the audience, when they're straightforward, clear, and logical, and when they articulate the desirable consequences of taking the actions suggested by the message. More attitude change will result if the conclusions are explicit in the message. Here's the takeaway message. And it's usually a good idea to pointedly refute the opposition, thereby giving the receiver of the message material to use in arguing against any opposing messages. Finally, messages are most persuasive when sources argue against their own self-interest. For example, Walster, Aronson, and Abrams, 1966, found that a message delivered by a prison inmate advocating longer prison sentences was more persuasive than a message in which the same prisoner argued for shorter sentences. When someone argues from a position contrary to obvious self-interest, the source of the message is seen as more sincere. A real-world example of this might be the case of Patrick Reynolds, whose anti-smoking advocacy is likely seen as more sincere by the mere fact that it goes against his own self-interest. He is the heir to the second-largest tobacco company in the United States. Arguing against self-interest, Patrick Reynolds, the grandson and heir of the late R.J. Reynolds, founder of the second-largest tobacco company in the United States, is shown speaking to students about the dangers of smoking. He watched his father and older brother both die of emphysema and lung cancer brought on by cigarette smoking. His anti-smoking speeches have high credibility given his family history, and the fact that his arguments, if effective, would ultimately reduce his inheritance. Vividness. When information is vivid, colorful, interesting, and memorable, it tends to be more effective. In fact, vivid but misleading information can often trump more valid and relevant information that's not as flashy. In a study showing that vivid information conveyed by a personal narrative with emotional punch can be more persuasive than statistical facts, the researchers first assessed attitudes toward welfare. In one condition, participants then read a vivid, gripping story about a woman who was a lifetime welfare recipient. The story was based on one that former U.S. President Ronald Reagan told to great effect about a welfare queen, a lifetime recipient of welfare who exploited the system to enjoy a life of comfort and leisure. In another condition, participants read facts about welfare, that the average time on welfare was 2 years, and only 10% of recipients received welfare for 4 years or more. In a third condition, participants read both the vivid narrative and the facts. In this condition, it should have been clear that the case was not typical of welfare recipients in general. Which message led to more attitude change? Participants changed their attitudes more if they heard the vivid story, even when they also had the cold statistics. The facts did little to alter their attitudes. Vivid images abound in the media, and their power is evident in the identifiable victim effect. Vivid flesh and blood victims are often more powerful sources of persuasion than abstract statistics. People are more willing to donate to a cause when an appeal is made on behalf of an identifiable individual than on behalf of anonymous or statistical victims. Identifiable victim effect: the tendency to be more moved by the vivid plight of a single individual than by a more abstract number of people. The death of a single Russian soldier is a tragedy. The death of 1,000,000 soldiers is a statistic. Joseph Stalin. The identifiable victim effect: people are more inclined to be persuaded to act on behalf of a cause by portrayals of clearly identifiable victims, such as the children in this compelling ad for UNICEF. Box 8.2. Focus on pop culture. Lie to Me. The popular TV show Lie to Me, which ran from 2009 to 2011, was based on the research of social psychologist Paul Ekman, who did the early studies on the universality of facial expression. See Chapter 6. Lying, of course, is one of the most challenging acts of persuasion, to get someone to believe the opposite of what you actually believe. Ekman, Bella DePaulo, and others have discovered certain cues to discern whether someone is lying or telling the truth. When people lie, they are more likely to show speech hesitations, face touches, micro-expressions of negative emotion, leg jiggles, speech disfluencies, such as scrambled word order, sudden rises in the pitch of the voice, and increased eye contact. Yes, increased eye contact. Liars exploit the conventional belief that people can't look you in the eye when they're lying. How good are people at catching liars? It turns out that most folks are surprisingly inept at this important task. Ekman and his colleagues have presented videotapes of people lying and telling the truth to thousands of people. Participants simply had to indicate whether each person was lying or telling the truth. Whereas chance guessing would yield accuracy rates of 50%, people were correct on average only 57% of the time. This same research yielded interesting answers about who's particularly good at catching liars. What's your guess? Contrary to what you might expect, those sages of the human character, judges, clinicians, and psychological scientists, proved no better than the average person. The one group that shone in their ability to catch liars was Secret Service agents, probably because they get sound training in the social psychology of lying just discussed. Recognizable victims are more apt to elicit feelings of empathy, thereby leading to a willingness to donate to worthy causes. The identifiable victim effect has limitations, however. For example, Koga, 2011, has shown that in cases where it's possible to blame a victim for his or her plight, making the person identifiable can actually breed negative perceptions of the victim and decrease rather than increase aid. Fear. Suppose you want to persuade people to act in order to avoid some dire outcome. Should you try to frighten your audience about just how terrible the outcome would be, or should you avoid such fear tactics? Let's return to our hypothetical campaign to reduce carbon emissions. Should you scare the daylights out of people with images of wildfires and flooded coastal areas, or should you expose your audience to tamer fare? The ELM offers somewhat competing notions regarding fear and persuasion. On the one hand, intense fear could disrupt the careful, thoughtful processing of the message, thus reducing the chances of long-lasting attitude change. On the other hand, the right kind of fear might heighten people's motivation to attend to the message, thus increasing the likelihood of enduring attitude change. What does the evidence say? In general, it's advisable to make ad campaigns frightening, but make sure they include clear, concrete information about what steps to take to address the source of the fear. Supporting this recommendation, Howard Leventhal and his colleagues tried to change smoking habits in one of three ways. They showed some participants a graphic film on the effects of lung cancer, which included footage of a lung operation in which the blackened lung of a smoker was removed. They gave other participants a pamphlet with instructions about how to quit smoking. A third group saw the film and read the pamphlet. Participants who only viewed the scary film reduced their smoking more than those who just read the bland instructions. In this case, fear was persuasive, but participants exposed to both the film and the pamphlet decreased their smoking the most. Figure 8.3 presents participants' self-reports of their daily smoking behavior a month after the intervention. In short, it appears that fear-eliciting persuasive messages that provide information that can be acted on can be highly effective. Figure 8.3 Fear and persuasive messages. Fear, especially when paired with instructions on how to respond to the fear, is likely to lead to attitude change. Then you can see a bar graph that shows cigarettes smoked each day. If you got just the instructions, you smoked about 15 cigarettes a day. If you got just fear, you smoked about 7 cigarettes a day. And if you got fear plus instructions, you smoked about 5 cigarettes a day, so the least amount. Inducing fear about something by showing vivid images reduced smoking substantially more than simply providing instructions about quitting. Fear plus instructions was the most effective treatment. Culture. Not surprisingly, it's important to tailor a message to fit the norms, values, and outlook of the cultural group of your audience. Thus, the message content in the media of independent and interdependent cultures often differs substantially. Marketing experts Sang Pil-hen and Sharon Savit analyzed the advertisements in American and Korean news magazines and women's magazines. They found that the American ads emphasized benefits to the individual, make your way through the crowd, whereas Korean ads focused on benefits to collectives. We have a way of bringing people closer together. In experimental studies that manipulated the content of advertisements, these researchers found that the individual-oriented ads were more effective with American participants and that the collective-oriented ads were more effective with Korean participants. Related arguments have been made with regard to upper-class individuals, who tend to define themselves in more independent terms, compared with lower-class individuals, who define themselves in more interdependent terms. Persuasive messages that appeal to independence may be more effective among higher-class individuals, whereas messages conveying interdependent themes may be more effective among lower-class individuals. Along related lines, recall the discussion in Chapter 3 about cultural differences in motivational orientation. Whereas Westerners tend to pursue their goals with a promotion orientation, focusing on the positive outcomes they hope to achieve, East Asians are more inclined to pursue their goals with a prevention orientation, focusing on the negative outcomes they hope to avoid. What do such differences imply for how best to frame a persuasive appeal aimed at Westerners versus East Asians? In one study, researchers recruited participants from a British university who identified themselves as white British or of East Asian origins, for example, Chinese Korean, and presented them with a persuasive appeal about the importance of flossing one's teeth. The appeal was framed in terms of either the benefit of flossing or the cost of not flossing. The white British participants were more persuaded by the gain-framed message, whereas the East Asian participants were more swayed by the loss-framed message. Message characteristics and targeting. Persuasive messages are generally targeted to collective concerns in interdependent cultures and individual concerns in independent cultures. Similarly, messages may vary at different times within the same society or culture. A. During World War II, U.S. Army posters stressed collective concerns. B. In recent times, Army recruitment posters highlight individual characteristics cultivated by military service, such as individual strength. So in the first World War II picture, you have one soldier helping another one, and like his gun raised in victory, and it says, "Our fighters deserve our best." And in the second one, there's a woman saluting, standing by herself, and it says, "They're strong." Then there's "Army strong. Are you Army strong?" And even shows her name badge in the middle of the logo. Audience characteristics. The work on culture and persuasion illustrates a broader idea. It's important to match the characteristics of the persuasive message to characteristics of the intended audience. In fact, researchers have discovered a range of audience characteristics that can influence whether a persuasive message is likely to be effective. Let's consider some of these. Audience characteristics. Characteristics of those who receive a persuasive message, including need for cognition, mood, and age. Need for cognition. People differ in their need for cognition, the degree to which they like to think deeply about things. Those with a strong need for cognition like to think, puzzle, ponder, and consider multiple perspectives on issues. This is the kind of person you might observe on the subway reading Scientific American or working through Sudoku puzzles on their smartphone. People with a weaker need for cognition don't find thought and contemplation that much fun. As you might imagine, people with a high need for cognition are more persuaded by high-quality arguments and are relatively unmoved by peripheral cues of persuasion. By contrast, people who have a lower need for cognition are persuaded more by easier-to-process peripheral cues. Mood. As anyone who's ever tried to win the heart of another can attest, it's easier to persuade when the person you're trying to woo is in the right mood. It's no wonder that sometimes people go to great lengths to create a particular mood in an audience they're trying to sway. Hitler staged enormous rallies for his most important speeches, surrounded by bold Nazi banners, awesome displays of military strength, soaring music, and thousands of supporters chanting and saluting in unison. His intent was to stir the emotions of his audience to make them more receptive to his ideas. Studies have found that people exposed to persuasive messages while eating or listening to beautiful music are more apt to change their attitudes. Persuasion and mood. The mood of an audience can affect whether a message will lead to attitude change. In Germany in the 1930s, Adolf Hitler staged rallies like this Hitler Youth Rally to create a mood of strength and unity that would encourage people to support his ideas. The effects of mood on persuasion can also be more nuanced. Dwayne Wegener and Richard Petty suggest that persuasive efforts tend to be successful when the mood of the message matches the mood of the audience. More pessimistic, counter-attitudinal messages, arguing against the prevailing attitude of the audience, tend to prompt greater message processing in sad or depressed people, whereas uplifting, optimistic, pro-attitudinal messages prompt greater message processing in happy people. Other work shows that inducing people to feel guilt can increase their compliance to a persuasive appeal, such as an appeal to engage in pro-environment behavior, so long as the message conveys how such behavior helps to repair the environment. In other words, guilt seems to lead to enhanced persuasion, so long as the communication offers people a way to alleviate some of their guilt. Box 8.3, focus on daily life. The timing of persuasive attempts matters. Whether you're trying to persuade your parents to help you finance a new car, nudge your romantic partner to take a job offer in a nearby city, or win a debate with a classmate about gun control, it's important to consider the 3 W's of persuasion: who, source characteristics, what, message characteristics, and to whom, audience characteristics. But what about the when of persuasion, that is, the timing of your persuasive attempt? Social psychologist Robert Cialdini has made a compelling case for the importance of the moments before a persuasive attempt. Sure, it can't hurt if you're attractive and come off as likable and credible, or if your message is brimming with convincing arguments, but Cialdini, 2016, argues that what transpires in the pocket of time right before you deliver your persuasive message can determine whether you succeed or fail to persuade. Cialdini uses the term persuasion to refer to this approach. The driving idea behind persuasion is that what people are paying attention to just prior to encountering a persuasive appeal is critical. You want to sell someone a product? Channel attention to the most favorable feature of that product and diminish attention to rival brands. You want to convince the public to support a war effort? Focus their attention on the suffering that would occur if we didn't intervene, rather than on the questionable nature of the facts about the enemy. You want to convince people to bike to work more often? Direct their attention to vivid media images of horrific car accidents, and so forth. Cialdini outlines a variety of psychological principles and processes that account for why attention is so important to effective persuasion, but the novel insight here isn't that attention matters. What's new are the many and often quite subtle ways we can direct people's attention one way or another in those privileged moments right before people are even aware that an attempt to persuade is coming. Cialdini gives the example of a company trying to get people to try a new soft drink. The traditional approach to persuasion would have the company hiring a celebrity to endorse the drink, citing compelling statistics on the appealing flavor of the drink, and perhaps commissioning commercials likely to appeal to the target audience. But a persuasion approach would focus on what you might do before a consumer is even presented with the persuasive attempt to get them to taste or buy the new drink. Researchers Bolkin and Anderson, 2009, tackled this very question. They got people to think of themselves as adventurous simply by asking them if they saw themselves as somebody who is adventurous and likes to try new things. Almost 100% of those asked responded affirmatively. Right before asking them for their email address so they could be sent instructions on how to get a free sample of the new drink. This led to an over twofold increase in the percentage of people who gave their emails, 76%, compared with when the simple, "How adventurous are you?" question was not asked, 33%. The lesson here? Don't just focus on what you do during a persuasive attempt. It's worth considering the precious moments right before. Age. Who is more likely to be persuaded by messages, younger people or older people? As you might have guessed, it's younger people. This finding has great real-world significance. For example, one source of former President Reagan's political success was the overwhelming support he received from the 18 to 25-year-old age group, the same demographic that backed President Obama in overwhelming numbers 28 years later in the 2008 U.S. presidential election. This young age group can be quite malleable when it comes to political allegiances. Another real-world application of the age effect in persuasion has to do with relying on children as witnesses in legal cases. In child abuse cases, for instance, how seriously the courts should consider the testimony of young children is a major issue in light of the fact that their attitudes can be readily altered by clever attorneys interested in winning a case, not at getting at the truth. A further problem concerns the extent of advertising directed at young children. Given that advertising can shape people's attitudes and does so more for the young than for the old, the immense amount of advertising directed at children 16 and younger is a serious concern. Let's return again to the example of changing people's everyday habits to reduce carbon emissions. How might the literature on persuasion help you design a campaign? Perhaps the most important lesson is to tailor your message to your audience. Certain people, including those for whom global warming is personally relevant, who know quite a bit about the crisis, and who have a high need for cognition, are likely to go through the central route to persuasion, responding to the deeper substance of the message. For people like this, there is no substitute for high-quality messages, ones that are logical and clear, that make subtle rather than heavy-handed recommendations, and that appeal to clear consequences and values. For many other people, and in many contexts, the peripheral route to persuasion is probably a better bet. For example, the peripheral route is likely to be more effective for younger audiences, for those who know less about global warming, and for people who don't think global warming is relevant to their lives. For such audiences, you might resort to attractive or credible message sources or vivid messages. Looking back, the three elements of persuasion are characteristics of the message's source, the content of the message itself, and the intended audience. In general, attractive, credible, and confident sources are effective at persuasion. Messages containing strong versus weak arguments will be more persuasive, especially through the central route of attitude change. Messages with vivid or fear-inducing content can also be quite persuasive, as can messages that are framed in ways that are culturally relevant. Audience characteristics include mood and age. Metacognition and persuasion. Beyond the who, what, and to whom elements of a persuasive message, a number of social psychologists have begun to examine how metacognition, the thoughts we have about our thoughts, can influence attitude change. The idea is that we have primary cognitions, the thoughts themselves, as well as secondary cognitions, reflections on the thoughts we just had. So, for example, in thinking about your attitude toward reducing carbon emissions, you're likely to think about the origins of carbon emissions and their effects on the environment. Accompanying these primary cognitions, though, could be secondary cognitions. For example, assessments of how confident you are in your knowledge about carbon emissions, the ease with which facts about carbon emissions come to mind, or how clear the facts seem to you. Growing research suggests that such secondary cognitions can have their own persuasive impact. Metacognition, secondary thoughts that are reflections on primary thoughts, cognitions. The self-validation hypothesis. One of the most extensively researched metacognitions has to do with the feeling of confidence, or lack thereof, we have in our reactions to a persuasive appeal. The self-validation hypothesis maintains that feeling confident about our thoughts, validates those thoughts, making it more likely that we'll be swayed in their direction. When we have doubts about our thoughts, we might disregard the thoughts entirely or even end up endorsing an opposing attitude. For example, we might have a number of arguments against posting the 10 Commandments in the city courthouse, but coming up with these counter-arguments is so hard that we end up accepting the idea. Maybe freedom of speech is more important than separation of church and state. In this example, we can see that how easily thoughts come to mind affects our confidence in these thoughts. How confident we feel about our thoughts can also arise from our perceptions of the accuracy of a thought or just from how clear a thought is in our mind. We have greater confidence and are thus more apt to be persuaded when we perceive our thoughts to be easily brought to mind, accurate, and clear. What's come over Heisenberg? He seems to be certain about everything these days. Self-validation hypothesis. The idea that feeling confident about our thoughts validates those thoughts, making it more likely that we'll be swayed in their direction. In an early test of the self-validation hypothesis, Richard Petty and his colleagues designed another study in which university participants read a persuasive message arguing in favor of a new campus policy that would require all seniors to take a comprehensive exam before they graduate, and then recorded whether their thoughts in response to the message were favorable or unfavorable. Participants were then led to feel confidence or doubt by recalling a situation in the past when they had experienced either confidence or doubt. In the condition where participants had recalled an episode of confidence, those who had previously generated mostly favorable thoughts about the comprehensive exam reported more favorable attitudes towards this issue. In other words, they were more persuaded than those with mostly unfavorable thoughts about the exam. What about the participants who recalled a time of doubt? Their attitudes toward the comprehensive exam were not predicted by the favorability or unfavorability of their thoughts about the exam. That is, they didn't rely on their thoughts to come up with their attitudes toward the senior comprehensive exam, presumably because those thoughts were shrouded in doubt. Thus, just as the self-validation hypothesis would predict, the favorability or unfavorability of one's thoughts influenced persuasion only when they were associated with a feeling of confidence. Embodiment and confidence. How confident or not we feel about the thoughts we have in response to a persuasive appeal can also come from nonverbal sources. For example, from whether our posture is upright or slouching, our tone of voice confident or uncertain. In other words, attitudes can be partly embodied. Recall, for example, the study from Chapter 7, in which participants who listened to radio editorials while nodding their heads up and down expressed more agreement with the editorials compared with participants who were shaking their heads side to side while listening. The idea behind this research is that nodding and shaking the head can affect attitudes because they are peripheral cues of agreement and disagreement, but the self-validation hypothesis suggests another mechanism to account for findings like these. Bodily movements can signal varying degrees of thought confidence, and it's this confidence that determines whether or not persuasion occurs. Embodiment and confidence. Nodding the head up and down while reading a persuasive message can result in more persuasion compared with shaking the head, but only when the message is made up of strong arguments. When the arguments are weak, leading people to have mostly unfavorable thoughts about the persuasive topic, nodding the head can boost confidence in these thoughts and actually lead to less persuasion compared with shaking the head. Brunel and Petty, 2003, found support for this novel prediction in a study in which participants listened to either strong or weak arguments in favor of a consumer product, headphones, while nodding or shaking their heads. The expectation was that strong arguments about the quality of the headphone would elicit primarily favorable thoughts about the product, whereas weak arguments would elicit mostly unfavorable thoughts. This was indeed the case, but how did the participants' head movements factor in? As you might expect, nodding while listening to the strong arguments led to greater confidence in the mostly favorable thoughts participants generated, leading to more favorable attitudes toward the headphones. In the weak arguments condition, however, students who nodded their heads were actually less persuaded than those who shook their heads side to side. This may seem surprising in light of the idea that nodding one's head is a sign of agreement, but the self-validation hypothesis accounts for this counterintuitive finding. Namely, nodding led students to feel greater confidence in the unfavorable thoughts they had in response to the weak arguments they were listening to, leading them to feel less favorable toward the headphones. The broad take-home point here is that it's important to understand people's thinking about their thoughts to have a fuller understanding of the dynamics of persuasion. Looking back, metacognitions, the thoughts people have about their own thinking, can influence responses to a persuasive appeal. The confidence people have in the validity of their thoughts is a primary example of a metacognition. Growing evidence indicates that when thought confidence is high, persuasion in the favorable or unfavorable direction of one's thoughts is more likely to occur.